Morning everyone, welcome to Our Small Footprint. My name is Nessa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Today's video is smoothie pops. So I was supposed to do the voiceover for this last night and I didn't manage to get to it, so I'm doing it this morning bright and early. Lucky it's warmed up, so I get up nice and early to check the greenhouse and stuff anyway. So I was supposed to have this out first thing this morning and I didn't manage it, so you're getting it now, like sometime today instead. So I put a photo up on my Facebook and Instagram to show the smoothie pops that I had made, and I make these every summer because there's something, the kids would eat them in winter too, to be honest, but I tend to make them every summer because the kids really enjoy them, and they ask for smoothies all the time, and I find that this helps with the portion control of it, because if I make a jug of smoothie, they just drink the whole jug, whereas if I'm making the smoothie pops, then I can get a whole lot more out of each jug of smoothie, and then they have them like twice in a day, so they might have one at morning tea, one at afternoon tea, and so it just works out better to stretch that frozen fruit and things like that, and to allow them to have the treat twice a day and not make whole big 2-litre jugs up at a time kind of thing. It works well for us anyway, and that might just be because of the quantity of kids, to be honest. We do have a personal blender, like a Tri-Best blender, which is similar to like a Ninja, that I could make individual smoothies in the cups, but that would be a lot of effort as well. So I find that this works. It's not that it's not a lot of effort, because it kind of is, but I find that it works well for us. It's easy access for the kids to be able to grab them. It means that there doesn't have to be a clean Thermomix or blender. We don't have a blender at the moment, we've only got the Thermomix, but it means that we don't have to have a clean Thermomix bowl if they want to make a smoothie, or if I'm using the Thermomix for something else. So it just gives us that ability for them to have them as a snack without an excessive amount of preparation on their behalf. On mine is another story, but anyway. We do a lot of just fruit batches, but we also do flavoured sort of decadent ones as well. So I thought I'd film the process of making them to bring you along and show you how we do them, and the moulds that we use I do have an affiliate code for as well that I'll put in the comments, and there's a code that you can get 5% off as well. So these are my choice of moulds for this sort of purpose. So come along and I'll show you what we made today, and we make lots of variations, but I'll show you what we managed to put together today. So I do a lot of variations of these smoothies, but we predominantly make fruit-based ones, like smoothie-based ones, but we do make some decadent ones as well, some more just for the sake of it, dessert-style ones as well. So today we've got plenty of eggs, so I decided to make a chocolate custard pudding pop, I think they're called in America. So we have plenty of eggs at the moment. We're at the end of the 6-week grocery haul, so there's not a whole lot of treats lying around. So the idea was that we could make these chocolate ones as well as some fruit ones. So I have made a variety of different flavors of these of these custard ones, like a salted caramel, and you can do any sort of flavor in the custard, but I just stuck with the old basic of chocolate for this one to bring you along. Now I use my Thermomix because it's just super simple. You can make these on the stovetop, it's just a custard, but the Thermomix is just amazing for this purpose. I put some coconut cream aside in a bowl first, and then I put everything else into the Thermomix. It's that easy. So it's, I harp on it a bit, but it's one of the reasons that I really adore my Thermomix for things like this, for white sauces and custards and stuff like that. You can pretty much throw the ingredients for the entire thing into the Thermomix, no set order, nothing else, and just turn it on and let it go. Being able to make like bechamel sauce for lasagna and stuff like that, this simply makes that process a whole lot easier. Any sort of custards and things like that also, it's just one of those things that I really enjoy about it. As I said, it's an awfully simple sort of a thing, but it's just something that I really enjoy about it. So I thought, this is, as I said, this is a chocolate custard, so I did 1 litre of coconut cream because we are dairy free. Obviously you can use any sort of cream you want. 4 eggs, about 150 grams of sugar. You can use whatever sweetener you like here in whatever consistency, but just remember that when you have frozen treats like this, once they're frozen, the sweetness and the flavour is diluted. It's to do with the texture of it on your tongue when it's frozen and things like that. So if you have something that's really not sweet at all that you're then freezing, it's going to be even less so when you're eating it frozen. So you just want to be aware of that when you're making these things and adjust the sweetness and flavour to your preference. The freezing just dulls it. It just makes it slightly more dull. But if you don't want to use sugar, you could use honey or maple syrup or a date syrup or something like that. I have raw sugar, and I find that the easiest thing to use. And realistically, all of those things are sugars. Yes, some of them add some other nutritional benefits, but they're all still just sugar. So raw sugar for me is the cheapest and easiest thing to use, especially in something like this where the flavour of the sweetener is going to be disguised. So I added the raw sugar, some corn flour, some cacao and some vanilla essence, put it all in the jug. Speed 4 at 90 degrees for about 9 minutes is what I find works. Or you can use the thickening mode on the TM6. So the TM6 has this mode on it called thickening, where you throw everything in for a custard or a white sauce or whatever else, and you just press start. And it has sensors in the blades in the bowl, and it senses the viscosity of the liquid that you're mixing, and it decides when it's done to the point that you want it done. It's a wonderful upgrade to the firmware of the TM6. It works wonderfully. But if you don't have a TM6, that's the sort of settings that I use for most things. While that was cooking, I took the coconut cream that I had put aside and I stirred some gelatin into it. Now, this is optional, but I find it helps keep the texture creamy when frozen. Less icy. Being an egg-based custard, it's already pretty good so long as you cook it to the right texture, but adding gelatin just improves it even more, and gelatin's good for you, so that's a win-win. Once the custard is pretty much cooked, I add in the bloomed gelatin and coconut cream mixture into the Thermix and turn it back on for a couple of minutes at speed 4 so it gets dispersed well and cooked in. You want to scrape the bowl down to get any corn flour or gelatin that is sort of set on the sides, and whiz it briefly again just to make sure that there's no lumps. You don't want to have to, if you make custard on a stovetop, quite often you have to strain it to get any sort of egg lumps or anything out, but in the Thermix it's one of the things that you don't need to do. So by adding the gelatin, you just want to make sure it whizzes up nice and fast in there to go through, so you don't have to worry about lumps in that either. I have a bunch of these molds from Kuvings. They're all different shapes and sizes. I really adore them. They're really sturdy. Their standard paddle pop sticks fit in them as well as the Kuvings ones. The Kuvings ones are slightly shorter than a standard paddle pop stick, which is nice, but the standard ones fit as well. They come with silicone covers for the tops of them. Not that I can ever find all the silicone covers, to be honest. They seem to go missing all the time. But I try and keep as many as I can. They do get dirty in our environment. Being silicone, dirt and dust sticks to them, and our cupboards don't always stay closed and we don't have a whole lot of storage space, but they are easy to clean, so it's not that big a deal. I do try and get them clean and dry and put them into a container so that it's sealed for next time I use them, or if I've got room in the freezer, then I put them in the freezer and store them in the freezer, because that's a really good way to store them too, but it just really depends on what I've got available. I use the smaller molds for the chocolate pudding. Whilst there's nothing inherently bad as such about the chocolate custard ones, they are more of a treat food than anything else. So I like to use the smaller molds for them. It makes me feel better about it being chocolate instead of fruit, I suppose. I left the custard a little thinner than I would have if I was serving it as a custard, just because I find it a little bit easier to get it into the molds than a scoopable custard, because you sort of have to pat it down and make sure it gets around the stick and things like that. I still cooked it for the same amount of time to make sure it was all emulsified, but I put a bit less corn flour in it than I would have if I was serving it as a dessert. At Christmas time, I tend to make this chocolate custard really thick and then whip it up and use it as a bit like a mousse in like my layers of my trifle and things like that. So I make this chocolate custard or flavoured custard quite regularly. It just varies on the thickness depending on what I'm using it for. So the sticks slide into the molds and are held in place by the little tongue that's on the tab. I'll show you how I get them out once they're solid. And you just put them on something flat and fill them. If you're using a thicker substance, you might want to just wiggle the stick a little, because this is just to center it in the middle of the liquid. But it doesn't really matter. It's more for aesthetics. If it's on an angle, then when you pull the ice blocks out, you can see the stick poking out, but it still works perfectly fine. But yeah, if you give it a little bit of a tap or a wiggle when you put the liquid in there, it's just going to center it in the liquid a little bit better. I use my baking trays to stack them on, because then I just slide them into the freezer until they're set. I find it the easiest method, though it does mean I have to find room in my freezer for the trays for 24 hours, which can sometimes be challenging, but I just do it. I preemptively go and sort out the freezer before I start filling the trays, so that once I've got the trays full, I can just slide them in there. It just means a shuffle, and it depends on which part of the month I'm in as to how much of a hassle that shuffle is. Once I'd used all the chocolate pudding mix, I started on another batch. I like to try and fill as many molds as possible all at once because I tend to allow the kids sort of 2 per day in the heat of summer, especially if we've run out of things like fresh eating apples and fresh eating bananas and stuff like that. And if you add that up, that's 12 per day, so they don't go real far. The next batch was more my standard style one and basically a frozen smoothie. So I had milk kefir that needed straining, so I did that first. I strained the grains out and then put them back in the jar and topped it up with milk. For some reason we have 2 open bottles of milk. I don't know why, but anyway. This sits on the bench for about 24 hours until it ferments, and then I'll put it back in the fridge. We use this milk kefir for porridge, baking, smoothies, all that kind of thing. A few years back, the allergist told us to try some fermented dairy products to see if the kids would tolerate them, and they tolerated them really well. So we still don't do huge amounts of it in general, but they all seem fine with yogurts and kefirs and home-cultured sour creams and things like that. We just don't overdo it. But that's been great for me because the ability to buy UHT cow's milk to make yogurt and cow's milk kefir and stuff is so much cheaper than trying to do any of these with coconut milks and things like that. So it's been great to be able to add that to the mix of things. If I have yogurt, it works here as well than milk kefir. Milk kefir's it probably works a little bit better, to be honest, because yogurt is generally sweeter because I mixed pureed fruit through it, but the kefir was pretty fresh, so it was sort of a sweet and tangy kefir rather than a sour one. But again, you just have to be aware that the smoothie that might taste nice and sweet when you're drinking it out of cup is going to be dulled a bit once it's frozen. It definitely loses some of its sweetness and some of its flavour when you're eating it in frozen form versus liquid form. I didn't clean the Thermomix bowl from the chocolate pudding. It's not going to affect the smoothie pops, and if anything, it's just going to add a little bit of flavour to it. So I put 1 litre of the milk kefir into the jug. As I said, this is a fairly fresh milk kefir, nice and sweet and tangy. It's not overly sour, so it doesn't, it should be fairly good. But you might want to add some sweetener to it, depending on what your preferences are and what your kids' preferences are. Some maple syrup or something in there, like you would in a smoothie. But as I said, you just want to sweeten it a little more than you would as a liquid. I put about 500 grams of frozen strawberries in. These are the strawberries I got last shopping trip, so they're fresh, sweet ones that I've flash frozen. And I put about 200 grams of blueberries in that are from Costco. And that's it. Sometimes I'd add frozen banana or mango or avocado or citrus or anything that I have frozen. This was the easiest access items that were in my freezer, so this is what I use today. But you can basically make whatever flavour you want as to however you would want to make a smoothie. It's going to work here. You can add other things into your smoothies too, like you could add hemp seeds, chia seeds, flax seeds, almonds, oats, anything that you would normally put into a smoothie. It does change the texture though, because like any sort of a frozen treat, if it's got something in it that's sort of granular, when you like lick an ice cream, it's going to leave that sort of rough texture on it, and some kids aren't going to like that. So it really just depends on who you're catering these to and what their taste tolerances are. But there is definitely a texture to it if you add anything that's sort of gritty, like a nut or a coconut or an oats or seeds and things like that. Even it doesn't matter how smooth you blend it, once it's frozen into a smoothie pop texture, it's going to melt around that rough bit. So you're going to like slide your tongue up the icy pole and there's going to be a rough texture. So it just depends on your audience as to who you're making them for and whether the kids are amenable to it and that sort of thing. I did add a drizzle of sunflower lecithin to the smoothie. Now, I have the lecithin because I use it for making dairy-free margarine or butter alternatives, so I already have it. It helps fat to emulsified water. I don't know if that's quite technically accurate, but it basically helps to stop ice crystals from forming because the water freezes faster than the fats in the molds. So then you get the ice crystals. So the lecithin emulsifies or sort of binds them together and helps to reduce the separation. Again, not sure exactly how technically accurate that is, but that's how it works in general. So I blended that through. I just put a drizzle of the lecithin in there and blended it through. Now, the reason I use the lecithin with the smoothie and the gelatin with the custard is that the gelatin requires heat, whereas the lecithin doesn't. So you can't use gelatin you can add it, but it's not going to give you any effect. It's just going to give you the nutritional benefit of adding gelatin to a cold substance. It's only if you add it to a hot substance, heated, is the gelatin going to activate as such, whereas the lecithin can be added to cold as long as it's blended really nice and well. The next day I pulled them out of the molds, partly to show you guys and partly to take a photo, partly because I find it easier to track quantities and how many are left and space-wise in the freezer if I pull them all out and put them in containers or into Ziplocs that we just reuse. So they come out super simple. They just flex straight out of the top and the stick slides out easily as well. They have a lovely smooth finish on the side against the mold, and this one I obviously forgot to put a stick in, so I cut open to show you the inside of it and then ate because, you know, I could. So it shows it's really nice and creamy on the inside, minimal icicle formation, just sort of a nice texture. Now, the gelatin based ones, there is a little bit of a bounce to them once they start defrosting, so just be aware of that, like, because gelatin has a bit of a bounce in a mouth texture, a mouth feel, so as they start defrosting there is a little bit of that bounce to it. Again, it's going to be personal preference as to what you like and what you don't, but we prefer them with the gelatin in them. So I pulled them all out of the molds and then stuck them in the Ziploc bags for the freezer. So I was going to put them in the bags, and then I decided a photo with them all laid out on a board would be nice and neat, so I did that instead. So I used my really nice Running Amok off the grid wooden board here for the photo to put all the ice blocks on there to take a photo. It wasn't overly hot, so I had time to do that. And then I stick them all in the Ziploc bags for the freezer. I didn't count them, I probably should have, but at a guess, having a look here, I think it was about 48 of them for the 2 jugs full of liquid. So theoretically 4 to 8 days worth, depending on if I let them have 1 or 2 a day, or depending if Daryl and I have some as well. Regardless, it's not a whole lot of days, unfortunately. So I have looked at those stainless steel bulk ice block makers and wondered if they would be a worthwhile investment, but because I don't make standard ice blocks or ice cream, I don't know whether they would come out of the molds well. And they are quite expensive, and they're quite large, and they have to sit sort of flat and vertical. So like I'd have to clear like a nice shelf spot for them to sit. But I did see that some of them have like 48s, 24s and 48s, but they're over $100. Vivor sells some of them, I think. So I don't know. I'm not sure. They'd have to be upright, they'd have to be flat, and then I'd have to pour my liquid in and hope that it all came out. Like imagine pouring 48 ice blocks worth into one of those molds and freezing it, and then none of them coming out right. Like the kids would still eat it. It's not that big a deal, I suppose, but it's still $100 and something for the mold that maybe isn't going to be worthwhile because they're made more for commercial purposes, which means that you're making like fruit juice ice lolly like ice blocks or things like that. So I don't know. I suppose doing this once a week isn't that big a deal. Just when you add it onto all the other tasks, it becomes a bit of an issue. So there are plenty of variations that you can do with these, and we do, and I'll show you throughout the summer. We can do really fancy stuffed ones. There's like a really nice cashew cream one that I've done with a caramel date center and then dipped in chocolate. A lot of effort, but very tasty. So yeah, you can dip them in chocolate, you freeze them, and then you dip them in chocolate. You can put a layer in the bottom, especially if you make it really thick custard or a really thick cashew cream, and then you can put something in the middle so that you end up with a stuffed, a bit like a Magnum or things like that. So lots of different flavors of custards in them as well, lots of different flavors of fruit. Sometimes when we get some really fresh fruit that I like you get sliced, if we get kiwi fruits, I can put circles of kiwi fruit in the mold and then pour the cream over the top. That's really nice. Or a Weiss style bar with the pureed mango and pureed coconut cream type stuff to go in them as well. That's really nice to have like a Weiss style one as well. So there's heaps of variations, and I suppose that the benefit of making it once a week is that I get to try all the different variations. But it is sort of time consuming, and they do wolf them down awfully quickly. But I should be used to that because that's pretty much food in general, isn't it? Like it doesn't matter how long I spend making food, they can eat it in a hell of a lot shorter time than what I take to make it. So I hope that gave you some inspiration for making your own this year, and I will put the link to the molds in the comments and to the cutting board as well. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions as usual, and I will see you guys on the next video. Thanks, guys.